There are few places in the universe as mysterious as the inside of a black hole, not because it is violent or dramatic, but because it represents a boundary where our understanding quietly stops, a region where the rules that describe everything else still exist, yet no longer behave in familiar ways. Black holes are often imagined as cosmic monsters devouring everything around them, but this image misses something deeper and far more unsettling. A black hole is not defined by what it destroys, but by what it hides. Once something crosses the event horizon, it becomes forever separated from the rest of the universe. No signal, no light, no information can return to tell us what lies beyond. Inside a black hole, space does not disappear, time does not suddenly end. Instead, both are reshaped so completely that the idea of movement, direction, and even later begins to lose meaning. The center is not simply a place you might reach. It becomes an unavoidable future. What exists inside a black hole is not something we can observe directly. It is something we infer carefully, using the limits of physics itself, and those limits are part of the story. Because when we ask what exists inside a black hole, we are really asking how far understanding can go before it must remain silent. Before we go any further, if you enjoy calm, slow journeys through the universe, you can subscribe to Theories Before Sleep and let these stories accompany you into the night. This is not a journey toward answers that resolve the mystery, it is a journey toward the edge of what can be known. A place where certainty fades gently, not violently, and where the universe reminds us that some truths are not hidden by distance but by structure. So let the outside world slow down, let the questions soften, and together we can drift inward, not to uncover what cannot be seen, but to understand why it cannot be seen at all. When thinking about what exists inside a black hole, the first thing that quietly disappears is the idea that space behaves the same way it does everywhere else. Outside a black hole, space feels passive. It is something objects move through. Inside a black hole, space becomes active. It moves, it flows, and everything caught within it is carried along not by force, but by geometry itself. A black hole does not begin as an object with an interior in the usual sense. It begins as a region of space where gravity has become so strong that escape is no longer possible. This region is defined by the event horizon. The event horizon is not a surface you can touch. It is not a wall or a membrane. It is simply a boundary in space-time where all possible paths forward lead inward. Crossing this boundary does not feel dramatic. There is no sudden pull, no shock, no moment of awareness that announces what has happened. Locally, physics behaves normally. You would still feel your own weight, still see light, still experience time flowing forward. But something fundamental has already changed. The future is no longer open. Outside a black hole, you can choose directions. You can move away from something. Inside, direction loses meaning. All possible futures point towards the center. Just as time carries everything towards tomorrow whether we want it or not, space inside a black hole carries everything toward what comes next. This is why escape is impossible. Not because the gravity is pulling harder than light can move, but because moving outward would require moving backward in time. And time does not allow that. Inside the event horizon, space and time trade roles. The inward direction becomes time-like. The center is no longer a place you might reach if you fall long enough. It becomes a moment you must reach, just as you must reach the next second. This is deeply unintuitive, because we are used to thinking of time as something that happens to us, while space is something we move through. Inside a black hole, space happens to you. It flows inward relentlessly, carrying everything with it. What exists inside, then, is not emptiness, it is not a void. It is a region where space-time itself is structured differently. Distances behave strangely. Paths curve inward no matter how they begin. Motion loses freedom and becomes inevitability. Light still exists inside a black hole. Photons continue to move at the speed of light locally. But every direction they take bends inward. Even light trying to move outward is dragged along by the curvature of space-time, its path folding back towards the center. Matter still exists as well. at least initially. Objects crossing the horizon remain intact for a time. They do not instantly collapse or vanish. They fall along with space itself, stretched and distorted as tidal forces grow stronger. These forces arise because gravity is not uniform across the object. The closer parts are pulled more strongly than the farther parts, creating tension that increases steadily. Far from the center, these tidal forces may be gentle, especially in very large black holes. A person crossing the horizon of a supermassive black hole might not feel anything unusual at first. The danger does not come from crossing the horizon, it comes from what lies deeper. As space continues to funnel inward, tidal forces increase. Directions that were once sideways begin to stretch. Other directions compress. The object's internal structure is strained not by impact but by geometry. Space is no longer a neutral stage, it is shaping everything within it. This stretching and compression is not arbitrary. It follows precise mathematical rules. These rules are described by general relativity, which treats gravity not as a force but as curvature. Inside a black hole, curvature becomes extreme. As curvature increases, distances shrink in unexpected ways. Paths that once seemed long collapse rapidly. Time available before reaching the center becomes finite. No matter how slowly you cross the horizon, once inside, reaching the center happens within a limited duration. This is one of the most unsettling facts about black holes. They are not infinite in the future direction. Inside, time does not stretch endlessly. It ends. The center, often called the singularity, is not a place we understand as a physical object. It is not a tiny dot of matter. It is not a point floating in space. It is a boundary in our description of reality. At the singularity, the equations that describe spacetime predict infinite curvature and density. But infinity in physics does not mean something truly infinite exists. It means the theory has been pushed beyond its domain of validity. So what exists at the center is unknown, not unseen but undefined. Our best theories cannot describe conditions there without contradicting themselves. Some possibilities have been proposed. Perhaps matter is compressed into a state governed by unknown quantum laws. Perhaps space-time itself becomes granular. Perhaps the singularity is replaced by something finite but extreme, a region where gravity and quantum mechanics merge into a new description. But these are ideas, not answers. What we do know is that information about the interior cannot reach the outside. The event horizon enforces silence. Once something crosses, it becomes causally disconnected from the rest of the universe. No signal can escape to tell us what happened next. This does not mean the interior does not exist. It means it exists without observers. It exists without communication. It exists as part of the universe that is structurally inaccessible. Inside a black hole, causality itself behaves differently. Events still follow cause and effect locally, but the global structure ensures that all effects remain trapped. The future becomes a narrow channel rather than an open field. This has profound implications. It means the universe can contain regions that are fully real, fully physical, yet permanently hidden. Reality does not require accessibility to exist. It does not require observation. Does not require interaction. Black holes demonstrate this more clearly than any other structure we know. They show that existence can be sealed off by geometry alone. Inside, there is motion without choice, structure without stability, time without extension, space without direction, matter without future beyond a single outcome. And yet nothing inside is supernatural. Nothing violates physical law as we understand it until we reach the singularity itself. The interior follows from the same equations that describe planetary orbits and gravitational waves. The difference is scale. At this scale, the familiar becomes unrecognizable. The interior of a black hole is not a place of chaos. It is a place of extreme order imposed by curvature. Everything is constrained. Everything is guided. Everything moves toward the same conclusion. This makes black holes unlike any other object in the universe. Stars explode. Galaxies merge. Nebulae disperse. But black holes enforce a kind of destiny. Once inside, the future is fixed. Not because of fate, but because of geometry. Understanding this does not require imagining fire or darkness or destruction. It requires imagining space itself changing character, becoming something that does not allow alternatives. Inside a black hole, existence continues, but possibility collapses. And that is perhaps the most unsettling thing that exists there. As the inward journey continues, what exists inside a black hole becomes less about objects and more about structure. The familiar idea that matter moves through space quietly dissolves, replaced by the realization that space itself has become the dominant actor. Inside the event horizon, nothing merely travels. Everything is carried. This carrying is not violent. It is not a pull in the ordinary sense. It is closer to drifting on a river whose current cannot be resisted, no matter how gently one tries to swim against it. The water does not rush, it simply flows in a direction that cannot be avoided. Inside a black hole, that direction is inward, and inward is no longer a place but a future. Because of this, the interior is not chaotic in the way explosions are chaotic. It is deeply constrained. Paths that would normally diverge instead converge. Differences that would normally spread instead collapse. Space funnels everything toward a shared outcome with remarkable consistency. This constraint reshapes matter gradually. As tidal forces grow stronger, objects are stretched along the inward direction and compressed along others. This stretching is sometimes described dramatically, but in reality it follows a smooth progression dictated by curvature. The experience is not one of sudden destruction, but of increasing distortion as geometry tightens its grip. In very large black holes, this distortion can remain mild for a surprisingly long time. The horizon itself may be crossed without incident. The forces that ultimately tear structures apart only become severe deeper inside, where curvature increases sharply. This means that, for a time, complex structures could exist inside a black hole, intact and functioning, even though their future is already sealed. This raises an unsettling idea. There may be moments inside a black hole where clocks still tick normally, where particles still interact, where internal processes unfold as expected. These moments exist without any possibility of external confirmation. They are real events occurring in a region permanently cut off from the rest of the universe. Inside, cause and effect still operate locally. Particles collide, fields fluctuate, energy transfers still occur, but all of this happens within a narrowing causal corridor. No matter what occurs, the outcome cannot influence anything outside. The interior becomes a self-contained sequence of events with no audience. This is where the interior of a black hole differs fundamentally from any other environment. Even the most distant regions of space remain connected by light, however faint. Inside a black hole, that connection is severed. Existence continues, but communication ends. As the center draws closer, the compression of possibilities becomes more pronounced. There are fewer directions to move, fewer choices available to matter and energy. The geometry restricts behavior more tightly with every passing moment. Freedom diminishes not through force, but through structure. At this depth, even the idea of stability becomes fragile. Atoms, which rely on delicate balances between forces, begin to struggle as tidal gradients stretch them beyond their limits. Molecules break apart. Larger structures dissolve into simpler components. Eventually, even atomic nuclei can no longer remain intact. This breakdown is not instantaneous. It unfolds as a sequence governed by scale. Larger structures fail first, smaller ones persist longer. But the trend is inevitable. The inward flow concentrates everything, squeezing complexity into simpler forms. Yet even as complexity fades, existence does not vanish. Particles continue to exist. Fields continue to propagate. The universe does not blink out inside a black hole. It becomes more uniform, more constrained, more extreme. As this happens, energy density increases. Space becomes more sharply curved. Time available before reaching the center becomes shorter. the interior grows increasingly dominated by conditions that our current theories cannot fully describe. This is where the limits of known physics become unavoidable. General relativity predicts that curvature grows without bound as the singularity approaches. Quantum mechanics, on the other hand, resists infinities and suggests that something different must occur at very small scales. Inside a black hole, these two frameworks collide. Gravity becomes so strong that quantum effects can no longer be ignored, but we do not yet have a complete theory that unifies them. This means that while we can describe the journey inward up to a point, the final stages remain speculative. What exists there may not resemble matter as we understand it. Space itself may behave in unfamiliar ways. Time may lose its continuous nature. The smooth fabric described by relativity may give way to a granular or fluctuating structure governed by unknown rules. Some ideas suggest that the singularity is not a point but a region where space and time lose their classical meaning. Others propose that the interior connects to something else entirely, perhaps another region of space-time. These ideas are not confirmed. They remain attempts to extend understanding beyond known boundaries. What is certain is that the singularity marks a breakdown in description, not necessarily in reality. The universe does not announce what replaces our equations when they fail. It simply continues according to whatever deeper rules apply. This brings the interior of a black hole into a strange category. It is a region where existence is undeniable, yet explanation is incomplete. It is not mysterious because it defies logic, but because logic itself requires tools we do not yet possess. The black hole interior reminds us that knowledge is not guaranteed to be complete. There are places where questions cannot yet be answered, not because they are forbidden, but because the framework for answering them has not been built. And yet, even here, the universe remains consistent. Nothing inside a black hole violates the principles that govern the rest of reality. It follows from them naturally. The same laws that allow stars to shine and planets to orbit also allow regions where information cannot escape, and futures collapse into inevitability. This continuity is important. It means black holes are not anomalies. They are consequences. They arise from the same rules that create everything else, taken to their extreme limits. Inside a black hole, then, what exists is not chaos or destruction in the cinematic sense. What exists is structure pushed to its boundary. Geometry becomes destiny, possibility narrows, complexity fades, and through it all the universe continues, quietly enforcing its rules even where those rules stretch beyond our current understanding. Inside a black hole, existence does not end. It becomes constrained, and in that constraint, reality reveals how much it can endure before explanation itself must fall silent. As the interior deepens further, the meaning of existence inside a black hole becomes increasingly detached from anything familiar. By this stage, it is no longer helpful to imagine falling through a place or travelling toward a location. What unfolds instead is a gradual narrowing of reality itself, where the range of possible states shrinks as space and time tighten around one another. Inside a black hole, time does not simply pass faster or slower, it becomes directional in a way that has no equivalent outside. Normally, time moves forward while space offers multiple paths. Inside, space offers no alternatives, and time becomes the only path. Every event, no matter how small, moves toward the same conclusion. This does not feel rushed, it feels inevitable. What exists here is a sequence of moments with no branching. Outside a black hole, the future is open. Many things could happen next. Inside, the future collapses into a single line. The universe still evolves, but it does so without choice. This collapse of possibility has deep consequences for how matter behaves. Outside, matter exists in many configurations. Inside, configurations simplify. Interactions become constrained. Fields align with curvature. Degrees of freedom disappear one by one, not abruptly, but steadily. Particles still exist, but their behavior becomes dominated by the geometry they inhabit. They are no longer free to roam through space. Their motion is guided by a structure that grows increasingly rigid as the center approaches. Even randomness begins to lose its meaning, because randomness requires alternative outcomes. Here, alternatives fade. At this depth, the idea of location becomes unstable. Distances that would normally be measured across space become compressed into time. Two events that seem spatially separated are instead separated by moments. The interior begins to resemble a timeline more than a landscape. This transformation challenges intuition because it reverses how we usually think about existence. Normally, we exist in space and move through time. Inside a black hole, existence unfolds along time, while space becomes something that happens to you. The center is not somewhere you travel to. It is something you approach in the same way tomorrow approaches today. Because of this, the interior is not a place you could explore. Exploration requires the ability to change direction. Inside a black hole, direction is fixed. There is no sideways, there is no away. There is only forward, and forward points inward. This has a quiet but profound implication. Inside a black hole, freedom does not disappear suddenly. It narrows gradually until it becomes irrelevant. Motion remains, but choice vanishes. As the inward progression continues, energy densities rise. The closer one comes to the center, the more compressed everything becomes. Fields intensify, curvature steepens. The smoothness of space-time begins to strain under its own structure. At some point, the assumptions underlying classical physics break down. The smooth continuum described by general relativity becomes insufficient. Quantum effects, normally negligible at large scales, can no longer be ignored. The interior enters a regime where neither framework alone can fully describe what exists. This is not because the universe becomes inconsistent. It is because our descriptions become incomplete. The black hole interior exposes the seams between theories, revealing where they no longer fit together cleanly. What might exist beyond this seam is unknown, but certain possibilities are suggested by attempts to reconcile gravity with quantum mechanics. Space may become discrete rather than continuous. Time may fluctuate. Geometry may lose its classical meaning entirely. In such a regime, the very concept of a singularity changes. Instead of a point of infinite density, there may be a region where density reaches a maximum allowed by deeper physical laws. Instead of a breakdown of reality, there may be a transition into a state that our current language cannot describe. If this is the case, then what exists inside a black hole is not an endpoint, but a boundary between descriptions, a place where the universe moves from one mode of behavior to another. This possibility reframes the interior in an unexpected way. Rather than being a graveyard for matter and information, it becomes a laboratory where the deepest rules of reality are expressed. Not violently, but silently. Information, in particular, becomes an important question here. Outside a black hole, information about a system can in principle be preserved and observed. Inside, information is trapped. But whether it is destroyed or transformed remains an open question. Some theories suggest that information is not lost, but encoded in subtle correlations at the event horizon, or redistributed in ways we cannot currently measure. Others suggest that information is preserved through quantum processes that operate beyond classical space-time. Inside the black hole, information continues to exist, but its accessibility vanishes. It may be scrambled, compressed, or transformed into forms that no longer resemble the original structure. What remains is not recognizable data, but a trace woven into the deeper fabric of the system. This reinforces a central theme. The interior of a black hole is not defined by absence. It is defined by restriction. Things do not disappear. They become unreachable, undifferentiated, and constrained. As the center approaches, these constraints intensify. Time available shrinks. Space loses distinction. Everything is guided toward a final state that we cannot yet describe, but whose approach is unavoidable. Importantly, this final state is not something that happens suddenly. It unfolds as the culmination of a long sequence. Every moment inside the black hole contributes to it. Every interaction moves closer to it. The interior is a process, not a static region. From this perspective, the black hole interior is one of the most ordered environments in the universe. Order here does not mean simplicity. It means inevitability. The rules are enforced without exception. Nothing deviates. Nothing escapes. This order is not imposed from outside. It emerges from the geometry itself. The same curvature that allows black holes to exist enforces their internal logic. Understanding this removes much of the fear often associated with black holes. They are not chaotic devourers. They are extreme expressions of consistency. They take the laws of physics and follow them to their logical limits. Inside, nothing supernatural occurs. There are no portals, no explosions, no violations of cause and effect. There is only structure becoming more constrained as scale intensifies. The universe does not break inside a black hole. Our descriptions do. This distinction matters. It reminds us that mystery does not imply disorder. It implies depth. The interior of a black hole is not unknowable because it is absurd. It is unknowable because it lies beyond the reach of the tools we currently have. And yet, even in this region of uncertainty, something remains clear. Existence continues. Events still occur, processes still unfold. Reality does not vanish simply because it cannot be observed from the outside. Inside a black hole, the universe carries on without witnesses. And in that silent continuation, it reveals a truth that extends far beyond black holes themselves. Reality does not depend on observation. It does not require accessibility. It does not pause at the edges of understanding. It simply follows its structure. Inside a black hole, that structure becomes so tight, so focused, so constrained, that everything moves together toward a single outcome, not with violence, with certainty. As the interior journey continues deeper, what exists inside a black hole begins to feel less like a place where events happen and more like a condition in which events are forced to unfold in a particular way. The universe inside does not behave violently or erratically. Instead, it becomes increasingly disciplined. Every process is narrowed. Every interaction is guided. Every possible future is filtered until only one remains. At this stage, the idea of resistance loses meaning. Outside a black hole, objects can oppose forces, slow down, change direction, or escape. Inside, resistance is irrelevant, not because forces are overwhelming in the usual sense, but because there is no alternative configuration available. The geometry of space-time has already decided the outcome, and everything that exists inside participates in that decision. This is where the interior becomes conceptually different from anything else in the universe. Even inside stars, even inside neutron stars, matter responds to pressure and balance. Inside a black hole, balance is gone, not because things collapse uncontrollably, but because collapse is no longer a process. It is the structure itself. Space inside the black hole does not sit still while matter moves through it. Space flows inward. It carries matter, energy, and even light along with it. Trying to move outward is not like swimming against a current. It is like trying to swim toward yesterday. The attempt does not fail because of effort, but because the direction no longer exists. This makes the interior deeply deterministic in a way that feels unfamiliar. Outside, even when physical laws are strict, outcomes often branch. Inside, branching disappears. Every moment leads to the next with no divergence. This does not feel dramatic. It feels quiet, almost smooth, because nothing resists the flow. As tidal forces continue to increase, structures are gradually simplified. This simplification is not sudden destruction. It is the steady removal of complexity. Larger arrangements fail first. Smaller arrangements persist longer. Eventually, only fundamental components remain, not because they are special, but because there is nothing left for them to decompose into. At this depth, the interior begins to resemble an environment where individuality fades. Particles are still distinct, but their distinctions matter less and less. Their paths converge, their behavior becomes increasingly uniform. Differences that once defined systems are erased by the narrowing of space-time itself. What exists here is not emptiness, but compression of possibility. The universe inside a black hole does not become nothing. It becomes less varied. Fewer configurations remain available. Fewer states can exist without contradiction. Reality simplifies, not by losing content, but by losing freedom. This simplification has a profound effect on time. Time does not speed up or slow down in the conventional sense. It shortens. The amount of time available before reaching the final state becomes finite and steadily decreases. No matter how gently or violently one enters the black hole, the duration of existence inside is limited. This finite future is one of the most unsettling features of black holes. Outside, time stretches indefinitely forward. Inside, time ends, not abruptly, but inevitably. The interior is not eternal, it is terminal in a structural sense. Yet even here, nothing feels rushed. The approach to the center does not accelerate wildly in subjective experience. It unfolds according to the geometry, which remains smooth even as it becomes extreme. The calmness of this progression is what makes it so difficult to imagine. At some point, the interior enters a regime where classical descriptions no longer apply at all. Space and time themselves are strained beyond the assumptions that allow them to be treated as continuous. The idea that space-time is smooth everywhere becomes questionable. Something deeper must take over. What exists beyond this point is unknown, but not undefined in the sense of chaos. It is undefined only because the language we use to describe reality has reached its limits. The universe does not collapse into nonsense our descriptions do. This distinction is crucial. The black hole interior is not a violation of physics. It is a demonstration of where physics must be extended. The laws we use were never meant to operate unmodified at infinite curvature. They are approximations that work extraordinarily well almost everywhere else. Inside a black hole, those approximations reveal their boundaries. At this depth, it is no longer meaningful to ask what matter looks like. Appearance requires light reaching an observer, and observation is no longer possible. What remains meaningful is structure. Relationships between events, ordering of cause and effect within a closed system. Inside, causality still exists, but it points inward. Events influence later events, but none influence anything beyond the horizon. The interior becomes a sealed chain of causes leading toward a single outcome. This sealed nature creates a strange form of isolation. The interior is not isolated because it is empty. It is isolated because it is complete. Everything that will ever happen there is already contained within it from the moment the horizon is crossed. This completeness does not imply simplicity. The interior may host extremely complex quantum processes, fluctuations, and interactions beyond our current understanding, but all of them are bound to the same narrowing future. In this sense, the black hole interior resembles a collapsing timeline rather than a collapsing space. Everything unfolds along it until the final state is reached. There is no extension beyond it, no continuation afterward. What that final state is remains unknown. It may not be a singular point. It may be a region where space-time reorganizes itself. It may be a boundary where new physics emerges. Or it may be something we have not yet imagined. What is clear is that the interior does not end in destruction in the ordinary sense. Destruction implies something breaking apart. Here, there is nothing left to break. Everything has already been reduced to the simplest form allowed by the geometry. Inside a black hole, the universe does not fight its own rules. It obeys them completely. The interior is not a failure of order. It is order carried to its extreme conclusion. This realization reframes the mystery entirely. The black hole interior is not terrifying because it is violent. It is unsettling because it is absolute. There is no negotiation with its structure. no escape through ingenuity, no loophole through clever motion. Reality inside a black hole is final, not because of force, but because of form. And this form exists quietly, without spectacle, without noise, without observers. It exists as a consequence of curvature shaping the flow of time itself. Inside a black hole, what exists is not darkness or annihilation. What exists is inevitability, and inevitability, when it replaces freedom, becomes the most extreme environment the universe allows. Deeper inside the black hole, what exists is no longer something that can be separated into layers or stages. The interior stops feeling like a journey through regions and instead becomes a gradual tightening of reality itself. The distinction between what is happening and what must happen grows thinner until the difference nearly disappears. The universe inside no longer explores possibilities, it enforces outcomes. At this depth, the idea of location becomes increasingly abstract. Outside a black hole, locations matter because they define relationships. Inside, relationships collapse towards uniformity. Distances lose significance not because they become small, but because they no longer influence outcomes. Whether something is slightly closer or slightly farther makes no meaningful difference. Everything moves toward the same conclusion on a schedule defined by geometry alone. This creates a strange calm. There is no turbulence in the usual sense. No competing directions, no chaotic mixing of futures. The interior is not noisy with activity, it is quiet with certainty. Motion continues, interactions occur, but all of it is aligned along a single, unavoidable direction. Matter that still exists at this depth no longer behaves as structured systems. The concept of an object becomes less useful. Boundaries blur, components stretch and compress until identity loses coherence. What remains are fields and particles responding directly to curvature, stripped of the complexity that once defined them. Yet even as identity fades, existence does not. Energy still exists, momentum still exists, conservation laws still apply locally. Nothing inside the black hole violates the principles that govern the rest of the universe. They are simply expressed under extreme constraint. Time, meanwhile, becomes increasingly scarce. The future available inside the black hole continues to shrink. This does not feel like acceleration, it feels like narrowing. Each moment carries less room for variation than the one before. The universe inside does not rush, it closes. This closing has a profound effect on causality. Outside, causes can produce a wide range of effects depending on context. Inside, causes produce outcomes that differ only in detail, not in direction. Everything contributes to the same final state. Because of this, the interior becomes less about change and more about completion. Processes do not evolve toward new forms. They evolve toward termination. Not in the sense of ending abruptly, but in the sense of exhausting all remaining degrees of freedom. This exhaustion is not dramatic. There is no final explosion, no last collapse. It unfolds smoothly as curvature tightens and structure simplifies. The universe inside does not announce its finality, it arrives at it naturally. At this point, classical ideas of matter cease to be helpful. What exists may be better described as concentrated energy configurations embedded in extreme curvature. The familiar separation between matter and space-time becomes blurred. Matter shapes space-time, but space-time also shapes matter so strongly that the distinction weakens. This mutual shaping suggests that what exists near the core of a black hole is not matter in space, but a unified structure where geometry and energy are inseparable. Space is not the container, it is part of the content. If quantum effects dominate here, as many theories suggest, then space-time itself may no longer be smooth. It may fluctuate at the smallest scales. The idea of a continuous interior may give way to something granular, probabilistic, or relational. But even in this regime, the overall structure remains constrained. The narrowing future does not reopen. This is why the interior resists description. Our intuition relies on freedom of motion, on the ability to imagine alternatives. Inside a black hole, alternatives fade. Language built for branching futures struggles to describe a reality with only one direction left. What exists here is not annihilation. It is completion of a process that began the moment the black hole formed. The collapse that created the horizon did not end at the surface. It continues inward, carried by the same geometry, until nothing remains that can resist it. This continuation does not require violence. It requires only time. And time inside a black hole is available only in limited supply. From the outside, this interior is forever hidden. No signal can cross the horizon outward, no information can escape. But this does not make the interior unreal, it makes it private, a region of the universe that exists without reference. This privacy challenges a deeply ingrained assumption. We often think that reality is defined by what can be observed. Black holes demonstrate that observation is optional. The universe does not pause at the edge of perception. It continues where perception cannot follow. Inside a black hole, existence proceeds without witnesses. Events occur that will never be recorded, never measured, never known. Yet they are as real as any event elsewhere in the cosmos. This realization reframes the mystery again. The interior of a black hole is not frightening because it destroys things. It is unsettling because it demonstrates that reality does not need to be accessible to exist. It does not need to be useful. It does not need to be understood. It only needs to be consistent, and consistency is exactly what the black hole interior provides. The same laws that govern everything else apply here, expressed under conditions so extreme that they leave no room for deviation. As the final state approaches, whatever that state may be, the universe inside does not resist. Resistance would require alternatives. There are none left. What remains is a closed evolution, a sealed narrative written entirely by curvature and conservation. Inside a black hole, the universe finishes a sentence it began long ago, using the same grammar but without leaving space for interpretation. There is no collapse into nothingness. There is no sudden disappearance. There is only the completion of structure under constraint. And when that completion is reached, whatever exists next exists beyond the reach of current understanding. Not because it violates reason, but because reason itself evolved in a universe where space allowed options. Inside a black hole, options end. What exists there is not destruction. It is inevitability brought to its quiet conclusion. At this depth, the interior of the black hole no longer feels like a region where something is happening, but like a condition that has fully taken control of everything within it. The universe inside is no longer transitioning toward an extreme state. It is already immersed in it. What remains is not motion toward change, but motion toward completion, where every remaining degree of freedom is gradually absorbed by the structure of spacetime itself. Here, the separation between past, present, and future becomes increasingly subtle. Events still occur in sequence, but the meaning of sequence weakens. Outside a black hole, the future is something that unfolds into many possible paths. Inside, the future is compressed into a single narrowing corridor. The flow of time remains, but it carries no uncertainty. Each moment does not ask what could happen next. It only delivers what must happen next. This has a profound effect on how existence itself can be described. Normally, existence is defined by persistence across time, by the ability of structures to maintain identity from one moment to the next. Inside a black hole, persistence becomes fragile. Identity dissolves not because things are destroyed, but because the conditions no longer support distinction. When every configuration is forced toward the same outcome, difference becomes temporary and eventually irrelevant. Matter at this depth is no longer best understood as objects. It is better understood as energy distributed within an extreme geometric constraint. The idea of an object having a stable shape or internal organization loses meaning. Shape depends on spatial freedom, and spatial freedom is almost gone. What exists instead are relationships defined by curvature. Energy follows paths carved directly by space-time. Fields align with the inward flow. Interactions still occur, but they occur within a framework that no longer allows expansion, escape, or rearrangement. Everything is pressed into participation with the same final structure. This is where the black hole interior becomes almost philosophical in nature, not because it introduces new concepts, but because it strips away assumptions we rarely question. We assume the universe always allows complexity to persist. We assume time always allows continuation. Inside a black hole, these assumptions are revealed as conditional, not fundamental. The universe does not promise endless futures. It only promises consistency. As the inward progression continues, the amount of time remaining becomes extremely small. Not small in a dramatic sense, but small in an absolute sense. There is only so much time available inside a black hole, and that time is steadily consumed by the inward flow of space-time itself. Nothing inside can slow this consumption. Nothing can delay it. The timeline is fixed. This fixed timeline does not imply panic or acceleration of experience. Subjectively, the experience remains smooth. There is no sudden rush toward the end. The interior unfolds at its own pace, defined by geometry rather than urgency. This calmness is deceptive because it hides the severity of what is occurring. Even as experience remains smooth, structure is being erased. Bound by gravity. Complexity is being removed layer by layer. The universe inside is simplifying relentlessly. At some point, even the distinction between different types of energy may blur. When curvature dominates everything, differences in form become secondary. What matters is how energy contributes to space-time itself, not how it is arranged internally. The interior becomes a place where form yields entirely to function. This suggests that near the deepest regions of a black hole, reality may be describable only in terms of abstract quantities like curvature, entropy, and conservation. The familiar language of particles and forces may no longer apply cleanly. Reality does not vanish, but its description changes. Entropy in particular becomes an interesting concept here. Outside a black hole, entropy measures the number of possible configurations a system can have. Inside, configurations are steadily removed. The number of accessible states collapses. Entropy may increase globally, but locally, freedom decreases. This inversion challenges intuition. We often associate entropy with disorder. Inside a black hole, entropy aligns more closely with inevitability. The system moves toward a state where no further rearrangement is possible, not because it is disordered, but because it is fully constrained. This constrained state is not static, it is dynamic, but its dynamics are limited to a single trajectory. Motion continues, but variation does not. Change occurs, but it does not lead to novelty. The interior thus becomes a place where time exists without history. Events happen, but they do not accumulate into narratives. Each moment replaces the previous one without leaving a structure that could persist. Memory, in any meaningful sense, cannot survive here because memory requires stability across time. Without memory, there can be no learning, no adaptation, no evolution. The interior does not evolve toward complexity. It evolves toward closure. This closure is not a failure of the universe. It is an expression of its limits. The same rules that allow galaxies to form also allow conditions where formation ends. The black hole interior is not an exception to cosmic order, it is one of its outcomes. From this perspective, what exists inside a black hole is not a mystery that needs to be solved urgently. It is a boundary that defines where certain kinds of questions cease to be meaningful. Questions about observation, communication, and continuation all rely on openness. Inside a black hole, openness is gone. And yet, existence persists. This persistence without openness reveals something fundamental. Reality does not require interaction to continue. It does not require expansion. It does not require observers. It requires only consistency with its own structure. Inside a black hole, that structure becomes absolute. The interior does not ask whether something should happen. It simply unfolds what must happen. The future is no longer a space of possibility. It is a destination that is already embedded in the present. This does not make the interior meaningless. It makes it complete. Completion here does not imply resolution or understanding. It implies exhaustion of options. The universe inside a black hole expresses everything it can express under those conditions, and then nothing remains that could change the outcome. What happens at the very end remains unknown. It may not resemble an ending at all. It may be a transition to a regime we cannot yet describe, or it may be a limit beyond which description is impossible. But whatever lies there is reached not by catastrophe, but by consistency. Inside a black hole, reality does not break, it fulfills itself. And in doing so, it shows us that the universe is capable of carrying existence all the way to the edge of meaning and beyond, without ever needing to explain itself. At this stage, what exists inside a black hole can no longer be separated from the idea of finality, not as an event that happens suddenly, but as a condition that has already taken hold. The interior has moved beyond transition. It has entered a phase where reality no longer explores, experiments, or rearranges itself. Everything that remains is already aligned with what will come next, even if that next cannot yet be described. Inside a black hole, the universe no longer behaves like a system evolving toward new structures. It behaves like a system completing the trajectory that was fixed the moment the horizon formed. This trajectory is not visible from the outside, and it does not require observation to proceed. It unfolds quietly, governed by geometry rather than chance. One of the most striking aspects of this environment is the absence of contingency. Outside a black hole, even simple events depend on many variables. Outcomes shift based on conditions, timing, and interaction. Inside, contingency fades. Outcomes no longer depend on circumstances. They depend only on position along the inward flow of space-time. This means that what exists inside is no longer shaped by interaction in the usual sense. Interactions still occur, but they no longer redirect the future. They only contribute to the same inevitable end. Cause and effect persist, but they no longer branch. They stack. This stacking of causes creates a form of compression, not only of matter and energy, but of history itself. Events occur, but they do not leave room for divergence. The past becomes irrelevant almost immediately, because it cannot influence anything beyond the next moment. There is no accumulation of consequences. There is only progression. Because of this, the interior becomes a place where time exists without narrative. Outside, time carries stories. Systems form, persist, change, and decay. Inside, time carries only sequence. One moment replaces another, but nothing persists long enough to be called a story. This absence of narrative is not emptiness. It is density of inevitability. Everything that happens matters only insofar as it brings the system closer to its final state. No event can change that state. No event can change that state. No process can delay it. At this depth, the distinction between different forms of energy becomes increasingly blurred. When curvature dominates all interactions, the details of how energy is packaged matter less than how much curvature it contributes. Mass, radiation, and other forms of energy lose their individuality. They become components of a single geometric structure. This suggests that what exists near the deepest interior is not matter moving through space-time, but space-time expressing energy directly. The usual separation between substance and geometry dissolves. Reality becomes self-referential. Space-time curves because of energy, and energy exists only as curvature within space-time. This self-referential structure is stable in its own way. Not stable as in unchanging, but stable as in consistent. Nothing inside violates the conditions that define it. The interior is not fragile. It is rigid. This rigidity eliminates uncertainty. Outside a black hole, uncertainty arises because systems can evolve in many directions. Inside, uncertainty has nowhere to go. The future is already encoded in the present geometry. Probabilities collapse into certainties. This does not mean quantum effects disappear. Fluctuations may still occur at very small scales, but even these fluctuations are constrained. They cannot accumulate into macroscopic differences. They cannot alter the overall trajectory. They exist briefly, then are absorbed into the same inward flow. At this point, it becomes meaningful to say that the interior of a black hole is one of the most ordered environments in the universe. Not ordered in the sense of structure or pattern, but ordered in the sense of outcome. Everything agrees on where it is going. This extreme order challenges the usual association between black holes and chaos. Black holes are often imagined as violent, unpredictable, and destructive. In reality, their interiors are among the most disciplined systems nature allows. Nothing escapes their logic, nothing deviates from their path. This discipline is not imposed externally, it emerges naturally from the curvature of space-time itself. Once the horizon forms, the interior is no longer free to evolve arbitrarily. It follows the rules to their conclusion. What exists here is not suffering or destruction, because those concepts require observers and comparisons. What exists is process without alternative. Completion without drama. The deeper one goes, the less meaningful it becomes to speak of what happens at all. Events still occur, but they do not lead to new conditions. They simply replace previous events as the system moves forward along its fixed trajectory. This leads to a subtle but profound realization. The interior of a black hole is not mysterious because it is hidden. It is mysterious because it reveals a limit to the kinds of worlds that can exist. It shows that reality does not always allow complexity, openness, or continuation. There are conditions under which the universe permits existence, but not freedom. Inside a black hole, existence persists without freedom of configuration. Things exist, but they cannot become something else in a meaningful way. They can only approach their conclusion. This conclusion is not visible from within. There is no marker that announces arrival. There is only the steady narrowing of time and the steady simplification of structure. Whatever lies at the deepest level, whether it is a singularity, a quantum region, or something entirely unknown, is reached not by collapse, but by inevitability. The interior does not rush toward it. It unfolds toward it. This unfolding does not end abruptly. It does not end violently. It does not end in silence or darkness in any human sense. It ends because there is nothing left to vary. At that point, the interior has expressed everything it can express under those conditions. Reality has followed its own rules as far as they will go. From the outside, this entire process is invisible. From the inside, it is unavoidable. From the universe's perspective, it is simply one of many ways existence can behave. Inside a black hole, what exists is not mystery layered upon mystery. What exists is consistency carried to its absolute limit, and in that limit the universe shows that it does not require openness, observation, or continuation to remain real. It only requires structure, and structure inside a black hole is all that remains. At this depth, the interior of the black hole has moved so far from ordinary experience that even the idea of inside begins to feel symbolic rather than spatial. What exists here is not something surrounded by boundaries, but something enclosed by inevitability. The black hole no longer feels like a region containing events. It feels like a rule being applied continuously without exception to everything that remains. The universe inside has reached a state where change still occurs, but change no longer produces novelty. Each moment replaces the previous one without adding anything fundamentally new. This is not stagnation, it is saturation. All meaningful variation has already been exhausted, leaving only progression toward completion. Time, at this stage, becomes less about duration and more about ordering. Moments still follow one another, but the distance between them feels irrelevant. Whether there are many moments left or few no longer matters in the way it once did. What matters is that all remaining moments serve the same function: carrying reality toward its final allowed configuration. This changes how existence itself can be defined. Outside a black hole, existence often implies persistence, interaction, and accumulation. Inside, existence implies continuity without accumulation. Things exist, but they do not build. They do not leave traces that endure. Each moment consumes the previous one completely. This is why memory cannot survive here. Memory requires stable structures that persist across time. Inside a black hole, stability is impossible beyond the most basic level. Structures are continually compressed, simplified, and absorbed into the inward flow. Even information, if it persists in any form, does so without recognizable organization. What exists here may be information stripped of meaning, correlations without context, data without interpretation. The universe inside may still contain everything that entered it, but that content is no longer arranged in ways that can be distinguished or retrieved. This challenges the usual idea that destruction is the opposite of existence. Inside a black hole, nothing is destroyed in the ordinary sense. Energy is conserved, laws are obeyed. What disappears is differentiation. The ability to tell one state from another fades until it becomes irrelevant. As differentiation fades, the interior becomes increasingly uniform, not spatially, but structurally. Everything obeys the same rule. Everything follows the same trajectory. Everything contributes to the same outcome. This uniformity does not imply emptiness. It implies completeness under constraint. The universe inside has no room left to express alternatives. It has already expressed them earlier, outside the horizon. Inside, it finishes what was started. At this depth, it becomes difficult to speak meaningfully about objects at all. The language of objects assumes separability, boundaries, and persistence. Inside a black hole, separability collapses. Boundaries blur, persistence shortens. What remains are interactions embedded directly in curvature. This suggests that near the deepest interior, reality may be describable only in relational terms. Not this thing exists here, but this event follows from that event. Existence becomes a chain rather than a collection. In such a chain, the distinction between cause and effect remains, but it becomes trivial. Every cause leads to the same effect. Every effect leads to the same next cause. Move through space. The chain does not branch, it tightens. This tightening reveals something profound about the nature of physical law. Laws are often imagined as rules that allow many outcomes. Inside a black hole, the same laws allow only one. The freedom we associate with physical systems is not guaranteed by the laws themselves. It is granted by conditions. When conditions change, freedom vanishes. The interior of a black hole is the clearest example of this. It shows that complexity, choice, and openness are temporary features of the universe, not permanent ones. They arise when geometry allows them and disappear when it does not. This does not make the interior meaningless. Meaning was never a physical requirement. Meaning emerged only in regions where structure persisted long enough to notice differences. Inside a black hole, noticing difference becomes impossible, not because perception fails, but because difference no longer matters. Reality here is not concerned with interpretation. It does not need to be understood. It does not need to be observed, it simply follows from its own structure. As the final state draws closer, whatever that state may be, the interior becomes increasingly simple in its behavior, even as it may be extreme in its conditions. Simplicity here does not mean gentleness, it means inevitability, without deviation. The universe inside does not hesitate. It does not reconsider. It does not explore alternatives. It continues because nothing interrupts continuation. This reveals a subtle truth. The interior of a black hole is not a place where the universe loses control. It is a place where the universe exerts complete control. Everything behaves exactly as required by geometry and conservation, without exception. In this sense, the black hole interior is one of the purest expressions of physical law. There is no room for approximation, no tolerance for deviation. Reality here is exact, and yet, despite this exactness, it remains inaccessible. We cannot observe it. We cannot test it directly. We cannot confirm our theories from within. The interior exists as a reminder that reality extends beyond the reach of verification. This is not a flaw in science. It is a feature of the universe. The universe does not organize itself to be known. It organizes itself to be consistent. Inside a black hole, consistency replaces possibility. What exists there is not chaos, not emptiness, not destruction. What exists is completion without commentary, a reality that does not explain itself, a reality that does not require explanation, a reality that simply continues until continuation itself has no remaining freedom. And in that continuation, the black hole interior reveals the ultimate limit of what it means for something to exist at all. At this depth, the interior of the black hole no longer resembles a process moving towards something new, but a condition that has already absorbed everything it can absorb. What exists here is not anticipation or transition, but persistence under extreme constraint. The universe inside has settled into a mode where change still occurs, yet change no longer introduces difference in any meaningful sense. Time continues to pass, but it no longer creates separation between states. Each moment replaces the last so completely that nothing accumulates. Outside a black hole, time leaves traces. Structures form, histories develop. Inside, time erases as it advances. The present consumes the past entirely, leaving no residue that could shape what follows. This erasure is not destruction. Energy remains conserved. Physical laws remain intact. What vanishes is relevance. Differences do not survive long enough to matter. Any variation that appears is immediately absorbed by the same inward flow that governs everything else. At this point, it becomes difficult to speak of motion at all. Motion implies moving from one state to another with the possibility of remaining different. Inside a black hole, movement exists only as progression along a fixed path. There is no sideways drift, no oscillation, no return. Everything advances in lockstep toward the same conclusion. The interior thus becomes a place where direction loses its usual meaning. There is no north or south, no inward or outward in the familiar sense. There is only forward, and forward is indistinguishable from deeper. The future and the center collapse into the same concept. Because of this collapse, the interior resists visualization. We instinctively imagine falling through space toward a point. In reality, the interior is closer to a narrowing timeline where space itself is part of the flow. What exists is not a location you approach, but a state you enter. This state is defined by constraint rather than force. Nothing pushes objects inward in the ordinary sense. Instead, the geometry leaves no alternative. Even if all forces were removed, the outcome would be the same. The structure alone is sufficient. This is why the black hole interior is so revealing about the nature of physical law. It shows that laws do not always operate by exerting influence. Sometimes they operate by removing choice. The universe does not always guide systems gently. Sometimes it simply closes every other door. At this depth, even the concept of interaction becomes abstract. Interactions still occur locally. Particles still influence one another, fields still respond to energy, but none of these interactions can change the global outcome. They are variations within inevitability. This suggests that the interior is not governed by chaos, but by constraint layered upon constraint. Each layer removes another degree of freedom until only the most basic progression remains. As complexity fades, what remains is not nothingness, but minimal structure. The universe inside expresses itself using the smallest set of distinctions allowed by its conditions. Everything unnecessary is stripped away. This stripping away includes not only physical complexity, but conceptual complexity as well. Many questions we ask outside a black hole become meaningless inside. Questions about survival, observation, escape, or continuation rely on openness. Inside, openness is gone. Even the question of duration loses relevance. Whether the remaining time is long or short does not matter when nothing can alter the outcome. Time exists, but it does not offer opportunity. At this depth, the interior becomes less a place of mystery and more a demonstration of completeness. The universe has followed its own rules to a point where those rules leave no room for interpretation. This completeness is not a final answer, it is a final condition. It does not explain itself, it does not reveal secrets. It simply exists as the logical conclusion of curvature and conservation taken to their extreme. What lies beyond this condition remains unknown. It may be that space-time itself ceases to exist as a meaningful concept. It may be that a deeper layer of reality emerges, governed by principles we have not yet discovered. Or it may be that description itself ends here, but whatever exists beyond is not reached by collapse or explosion. It is reached by continuation, the same quiet continuation that has guided the interior from the moment the horizon formed. Inside a black hole, nothing dramatic needs to happen for everything to change. Change occurs because nothing interrupts it. This reveals a deeper truth about the universe. Extremes do not always manifest as violence. Sometimes they manifest as inevitability so complete that it feels almost still. The interior of a black hole is such an extreme. It is a place where motion exists without freedom, where time exists without narrative, and where existence persists without possibility. This does not mean the interior is dead. It is alive with process, but the process no longer leads anywhere new. In this sense, the black hole interior is not an ending in the dramatic sense. It is an ending in the logical sense. A place where the universe has exhausted all the options allowed by its structure. Outside, the universe is rich with variety. Stars burn, galaxies collide, complexity rises and falls. Inside, variety collapses. What remains is the bare expression of law, and that expression continues quietly, without witnesses, without commentary, until even the distinction between continuation and conclusion becomes irrelevant. Inside a black hole, existence does not shout its final moment, it simply arrives. And when it does, there is nothing left that could have happened differently. At this stage, the interior of the black hole has moved so far beyond ordinary conditions that even the idea of an endpoint begins to lose its usual meaning. What exists here is not something approaching a dramatic finish, but something settling into a state where change no longer has room to express itself in varied ways. The universe inside is not collapsing toward chaos. It is converging towards uniformity under absolute constraint. Time continues to move forward, but it no longer feels like a resource. Outside a black hole, time offers opportunity. Systems can form, adapt, recover, or fail. Inside, time offers only completion. Each moment exists to carry reality one step closer to a condition where nothing further can vary. Time does not open doors here. It closes them. This closing is subtle. There is no instant where freedom disappears all at once. Instead, freedom is reduced continuously, like a dimmer being slowly turned down. Possibility narrows until it becomes indistinguishable from certainty. By the time this stage is reached, the difference between what could happen and what will happen has effectively vanished. Because of this, the interior no longer supports complexity in any meaningful way. Complexity requires persistence and variation. It requires structures that can maintain differences across time. Inside a black hole, differences are short-lived. They are smoothed out by the inward flow of space-time before they can accumulate or stabilize. What exists here is therefore not a collection of things, but a condition of reality where everything participates in the same outcome. Matter, energy, and even space-time itself are no longer independent elements. They are aspects of a single process unfolding according to geometry alone. This process does not feel rushed. It does not feel violent. It feels quiet, steady, and unavoidable. The interior does not scream its extremity. It expresses it through the absence of alternatives. At this depth, the idea of observation becomes meaningless. Observation requires separation between observer and observed. Inside a black hole, separation collapses. Everything is bound into the same inward progression. There is no vantage point from which to step back and look. This reinforces a profound lesson. Reality does not require observation to exist. It does not require witnesses. It does not require interpretation. The interior of a black hole continues to unfold even though no information from it can ever be received. Existence here is self-contained. It does not interact with the outside universe. It does not influence anything beyond the horizon. It simply follows its own internal consistency until that consistency has nothing left to express. At this point, even the question of what exists becomes abstract. The familiar categories we use to describe existence lose relevance. Objects dissolve, events blur, processes dominate. What remains is structure unfolding without reference. This unfolding may involve physics we do not yet understand. Quantum effects may dominate. Quantum. But space-time itself may fluctuate or reorganize. But even these unknown processes are constrained. They cannot alter the global outcome. They exist within a narrowing framework that permits no escape. This is why the black hole interior is such a powerful concept. It reveals that the universe allows regions where openness ends, where the richness of possibility collapses into a single path, where the future is not something to be discovered, but something to be fulfilled. Inside a black hole, fulfillment does not mean resolution in a narrative sense. It means exhaustion of degrees of freedom. The universe has expressed everything it can express under those conditions, and nothing remains that could lead to a different result. This exhaustion is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply manifests as sameness across moments. Each moment resembles the last not because nothing is happening, but because everything that happens leads to the same outcome. At this depth, even language begins to fail. Words like inside, approach, and center are metaphors rather than accurate descriptions. They are approximations used to gesture toward a structure that cannot be fully captured by spatial intuition. What exists here is better understood as a terminal regime of space-time, a region where the rules that normally allow variety no longer permit it. The universe is not broken, it has become exact. Exactness here does not mean clarity, it means rigidity. The interior does not tolerate deviation, it does not allow improvisation. Every process aligns with the same inward direction. This alignment reveals something fundamental about the universe. Freedom is not guaranteed, it emerges only under certain conditions. When those conditions disappear, freedom disappears with them. Inside a black hole, freedom of configuration ends. What remains is existence without choice. This existence is not empty. It is not void. It is filled with process, energy, and structure. But that structure no longer supports complexity or persistence. It supports only progression. As the final state draws ever closer, whatever that state may be, the interior does not accelerate toward it. It does not resist it. It simply continues. There is no final moment that stands apart from the rest. No last event that can be pointed to as an ending. The interior does not end in a way that can be marked or remembered. Instead, it reaches a condition where nothing further can change in a meaningful way. At that point, the distinction between change and stasis becomes irrelevant. The universe inside has become functionally complete. This functional completeness does not imply satisfaction or resolution. Those are human concepts. It implies sufficiency. The interior requires nothing else to exist as it is. From the outside, this entire progression remains hidden. The black hole appears static, defined only by mass, charge, and spin. All of the interior complexity is sealed away, inaccessible and silent. Yet this silence does not imply absence. It implies containment. Inside a black hole, reality continues without reference, without communication, and without alternative. And in that continuation, the universe demonstrates one of its most extreme capabilities, the ability to sustain existence even when possibility has been reduced to zero. What exists inside a black hole at this depth is not mystery waiting to be solved, it is reality reaching the edge of what it can be. At this stage, the interior of the black hole exists in a condition where even the idea of progression becomes subtle. It is no longer clear whether reality is still moving towards something, or whether it has already arrived at a state where movement and arrival are indistinguishable. What exists here is not anticipation of an ending, but a form of persistence, where nothing new can meaningfully emerge. Inside the black hole, the universe has reached a depth where difference itself struggles to survive. Outside, difference is what allows systems to evolve. Temperatures vary, energies flow, structures form and decay. Inside, difference fades because the geometry no longer allows it to amplify. Any variation that appears is immediately flattened by the same inward structure that governs everything else. This flattening does not imply uniformity in a simple sense. Conditions may still be extreme. Curvature may still vary. Quantum fluctuations may still arise, but these variations no longer matter at the level of outcome. They cannot redirect the future. They cannot create alternative paths. They exist briefly, then dissolve into the same overall progression. This is where the interior begins to resemble a limit rather than a location. It is a regime of reality where the usual tools for describing change no longer apply cleanly. Concepts like stability, instability, growth or decay lose relevance when nothing persists long enough to embody them. Time still orders events, but it no longer supports history. Outside a black hole, time allows memory. Events leave traces, structures carry information forward. Inside, time replaces itself completely with each moment. There is no accumulation. The present overwrites the past entirely. This has a profound implication for information. Information in the physical sense depends on distinguishable states that persist. Inside a black hole, distinguishability collapses. States may still exist, but they cannot remain distinct long enough to be meaningful in the way information usually is. What exists here may be information in a deeply transformed sense, correlations without context, patterns without persistence. Everything that once carried identity becomes compressed into a form that no longer resembles what entered. This does not mean information is destroyed. It means information is no longer accessible or recognizable. The universe inside may still contain every detail of what fell in, but those details are no longer arranged in a way that allows retrieval or interpretation. This distinction is subtle but important. Destruction implies loss. Transformation implies persistence without familiarity. Inside a black hole, persistence continues without accessibility. At this depth, even the idea of cause and effect becomes minimal. Causes still produce effects, but the range of effects is extremely narrow. Everything leads to the same type of outcome. The richness of causal networks collapses into a single chain. This chain does not branch, it tightens. Because of this tightening, the interior becomes almost timeless in feeling. Even though time still exists when nothing changes in a way that matters, the passage of time loses significance. Moments occur, but they do not accumulate into experience. Experience, in any meaningful sense, cannot exist here. Experience requires memory, contrast, and persistence. Inside a black hole, these prerequisites vanish. What exists is process without awareness, continuation without narrative. This highlights a critical point. Consciousness, meaning, and observation are not fundamental features of reality. They are emergent features that arise only under certain conditions. Inside a black hole, those conditions are absent. Reality here does not pause because it is not observed. It does not slow because it is not understood. It continues because nothing prevents it from continuing. This continuation is exact. There is no room for error or deviation. The interior obeys the same principles that govern everything else, but under conditions where those principles leave no room for interpretation. At this stage, the interior may be dominated by physics we do not yet possess the language to describe. Quantum gravity effects may govern the behavior of space-time itself. The smooth geometry described by general relativity may no longer apply. Space-time may become fragmented, probabilistic, or relational. But even if space-time itself becomes something entirely unfamiliar, the overall structure remains constrained. The narrowing of the future does not reverse. The interior does not reopen into possibility. This suggests that what exists here is not chaos beyond comprehension, but order beyond intuition. The universe is not breaking its rules, it is applying them so completely that they leave nothing unexplored. The interior thus becomes a mirror held up to our assumptions. We often assume the universe is inherently open-ended, creative, and evolving. Black holes show that these qualities are conditional. They arise when geometry allows freedom. They disappear when geometry removes it. Inside a black hole, geometry removes freedom entirely. This removal is not moral. It is not purposeful. It is not hostile. It is simply what happens when space-time curves beyond a certain threshold. At this depth, the interior no longer supports the kinds of questions we usually ask about existence. Questions about survival, escape, continuation, or meaning all depend on openness. Inside, openness is gone. What remains is existence stripped of interpretation. This does not make the interior meaningless. Meaning was never a physical requirement. Meaning arose only in regions where difference persisted long enough to be noticed. Inside a black hole, noticing becomes impossible, not because perception fails, but because difference no longer matters. Reality here is not dark, not empty, not silent in any experiential sense. It is simply uninterpreted. The universe does not reflect on its own state. It does not evaluate outcomes. It does not anticipate what comes next. Anticipation requires alternatives. Inside, alternatives are gone. This absence of alternatives is what defines the interior more than any extreme value of density or curvature. The black hole is extreme not because things are compressed, but because possibilities are. As the interior approaches its deepest regime, whatever that may be, the universe does not accelerate toward it. It does not collapse into it violently. It continues toward it smoothly, guided entirely by structure. This smoothness is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. There is no final struggle, no dramatic ending, no sudden transformation that can be pointed to as the moment. The interior simply reaches a state where nothing further can change in a meaningful way. At that point, the distinction between happening and being becomes irrelevant. Reality no longer unfolds. It simply remains as the final expression of what those conditions allow. From the outside, this entire process is invisible. From the inside, it is unavoidable. From the universe's perspective, it is simply one outcome among many that geometry permits. Inside a black hole, what exists is not annihilation. What exists is reality carried all the way to the limit of variation. And beyond that limit, whatever remains exists without needing to be different. At this depth, the interior of the black hole has reached a state where even the language of limits begins to feel inadequate, because limits usually imply something pushing against them, and here there is no resistance left. What exists is not a system pressing toward a boundary, but a condition that has already absorbed every possible alternative. The universe inside no longer approaches an edge, it exists entirely within it. Reality here does not fluctuate between states in a way that creates contrast. Contrast requires difference that can persist long enough to be compared. Inside a black hole, persistence has been reduced to its minimum. Each moment replaces the last so completely that comparison becomes meaningless. There is no before that can be held against an after. There is only sequence without memory. Time still orders events, but the ordering no longer produces narrative. Outside, Narratives emerge because events accumulate into structures that endure. Inside, endurance is absent. Events occur, but they dissolve into the same inward flow almost immediately. The universe does not remember itself from one moment to the next. This absence of memory is not an erasure imposed from outside. It emerges naturally from the constraints of geometry. Memory requires stable configurations, and stability requires space to allow persistence. Inside a black hole, space offers no such allowance. Everything is continually reshaped by curvature until stability becomes impossible. Because of this, identity cannot survive here. Identity requires continuity. It requires that something remain recognizably itself across time. Inside, continuity collapses. Whatever exists now will not exist in the same form in the next moment. And yet, existence continues, stripped of identity but not extinguished. This creates a strange condition where reality persists without entities. There may be energy, curvature, and process, but not objects in the usual sense. What exists is not a collection of things, but a continuous transformation governed entirely by structure. At this depth, it becomes misleading to imagine matter being crushed or destroyed. Crushing implies an external force acting on an object. Inside a black hole, there is no external reference frame. There is only the internal structure unfolding. Matter does not resist this unfolding. It is part of it. This is why the interior feels so unlike any other environment. Even the most extreme stars still involve balances between forces. Inside a black hole, balance is no longer possible. The geometry has already decided the outcome. Forces no longer compete. They align. This alignment creates a condition where even randomness loses relevance. Randomness requires a space of possibilities from which outcomes can be drawn. Inside, the space of possibilities has collapsed. Fluctuations may still occur at microscopic scales, but they cannot grow into macroscopic differences. They vanish as quickly as they arise. As a result, the interior becomes increasingly uniform in its behavior, even if conditions remain extreme. Uniformity here does not mean sameness of value, but sameness of direction. Everything moves toward the same conclusion, regardless of its initial state. This conclusion may not be a point or a surface. It may not resemble anything we can visualize. It may be a regime where space-time itself loses its familiar properties. But whatever it is reached not through conflict or collapse, but through consistency. The interior thus reveals something fundamental about the universe. Reality does not require perpetual change to exist. It does not require complexity. It does not require openness. It can persist under conditions where nothing new can arise. This persistence challenges the assumption that existence must always lead somewhere. Inside a black hole, existence leads nowhere new. It simply continues until continuation itself has no remaining variation. At this stage, even the concept of an endpoint becomes questionable. An endpoint implies a transition from one state to another. Here, transition has already exhausted itself. What remains is not a crossing into something else, but a settling into a final, allowed mode of being. This final mode may still involve activity, fields may still fluctuate, curvature may still evolve, but these changes no longer alter the overall condition. They exist within it, not beyond it. In this sense, the black hole interior is not a place where the universe fails to evolve. It is a place where evolution has completed its role. All that remains is persistence under constraint. This persistence does not carry meaning. Meaning arises from difference, from the ability to compare one state to another. Inside, comparison no longer applies. The universe here does not reflect, does not evaluate, does not interpret. It simply exists, and this existence does not depend on being known. It does not depend on being seen. It does not depend on being useful. It continues because nothing prevents it from continuing. The black hole interior thus stands as a reminder that the universe, is larger than our frameworks of understanding. There are conditions where our concepts of time, identity, and change cease to apply, not because reality becomes illogical, but because it becomes too consistent for those concepts to remain meaningful. Inside a black hole, reality is not chaotic. It is exact. It is not empty. It is complete under its own rules. As the interior reaches its deepest regime, whatever that may be, the universe does not announce it. There is no final moment that can be marked, no event that can be labelled as the end. The interior simply reaches a condition where nothing further can differ. At that point, reality does not stop. It remains, and in that remaining, the black hole interior reveals the ultimate expression of physical law: existence without alternatives, persistence without possibility, structure without interpretation. This is not annihilation. It is reality continuing when variation has finally been exhausted. At this depth, the interior of the black hole has reached a condition where even the concept of completion becomes subtle, because completion usually implies a contrast with beginning, and inside a black hole, contrast itself has been dissolved. What exists here is not an ending that follows a story, but a state where stories are no longer possible. The universe inside has moved beyond progression as we understand it, and into a form of persistence that no longer generates distinction. Reality here does not oscillate between phases. It does not cycle. It does not renew itself. It continues in a manner that is neither dynamic nor static in any familiar sense. Change still occurs, but it does not accumulate into history. Each moment arises and replaces the last without leaving a trace that could influence what follows. The interior exists in a perpetual present that erases itself continuously. This perpetual present is not a freeze. It is a flow so constrained that it no longer produces variation. Outside a black hole, flow creates diversity. Rivers carve landscapes. Time shapes complexity. Inside, flow compresses everything into the same narrow channel. Diversity is not destroyed, it is rendered irrelevant. At this point, even the idea of scale begins to collapse. Normally, scale allows us to distinguish between large and small, near and far, significant and insignificant. Inside a black hole, scale loses its power. Whether something is large or small no longer affects its fate. Everything follows the same inward trajectory regardless of magnitude. This reveals a subtle truth about the universe. Scale matters only where geometry allows options. Inside a black hole, geometry removes options entirely. The largest structure and the smallest fluctuation are treated the same way by spacetime itself. Both are absorbed into the same progression. This absorption does not occur through force or collision. It occurs through alignment. Everything aligns with the curvature that defines the interior. Once aligned, deviation becomes impossible. Reality here does not resist alignment. Resistance requires an alternative state to resist toward, and no such state exists. At this depth, the separation between what exists and how it exists becomes meaningless. Existence is no longer something that happens within a framework. It is the framework expressing itself. Matter, energy, and space-time are no longer distinguishable categories. They are aspects of a single structure unfolding. This unified structure may still be governed by laws we do not yet understand. Quantum gravity may dominate. The smooth geometry of space-time may give way to discrete or probabilistic behavior, but whatever deeper description applies, it applies everywhere inside the interior without exception. There are no pockets of freedom left. This universality removes any remaining sense of contingency. Nothing inside depends on conditions in the way we normally think of them. Conditions exist, but they no longer determine outcomes. Outcomes are already fixed by structure alone. Because of this, the interior becomes a place where even the concept of survival loses meaning. Survival implies continuation into an open future. Inside, the future is not open. It is finite and predetermined. Existence does not survive. It completes. This completion is not abrupt. It does not announce itself. It does not occur at a specific moment that can be isolated. It unfolds gradually as every remaining degree of freedom is absorbed. Where nothing remains that could vary, completion has already occurred, even if process continues. At this depth, the universe inside does not experience decay or collapse. Decay implies breakdown from a stable state. Here, stability was never possible. The interior never allowed persistence long enough to decay. What exists dissolves into the same structure that produced it. This dissolution is not destruction. Destruction implies loss. Nothing is lost here. Everything is conserved in some form, even if that form no longer resembles what existed before. The universe inside retains its content, but not its distinctions. This retention without distinction challenges one of our deepest intuitions. We tend to believe that to exist is to be identifiable. Inside a black hole, existence does not require identity. It requires only consistency with structure. Identity, like meaning, is an emergent feature that arises only under certain conditions. Those conditions include openness, persistence, and contrast. Inside a black hole, none of these conditions apply. As a result, the interior is not hostile to identity, it simply does not support it. Identity fades not because it is attacked, but because it cannot be maintained. This fading extends even to the idea of inside itself. As the interior deepens, the distinction between being inside and approaching the center loses relevance. Everything that exists is already within the same regime. There is no deeper region that feels categorically different. The interior becomes uniform in its inevitability. This uniformity does not imply that nothing happens. It implies that whatever happens does not matter in a way that can change the overall condition. Events occur, but they do not alter direction. They do not introduce novelty. They do not escape absorption. The universe inside thus becomes a closed expression of its own rules. There is no dialogue with the outside, no feedback, no correction. What exists entirely on its own terms. This isolation is not a separation imposed from outside. It is a consequence of geometry. The event horizon does not block communication like a wall. It reshapes space-time so completely that communication outward is no longer part of reality's structure. Inside, everything communicates inward. This inward communication does not transmit information in the usual sense. It transmits inevitability. Each moment informs the next, not of possibilities but of necessity. At this depth, the interior becomes almost serene in its extremity. There is no struggle, no instability, no conflict between forces. Everything agrees on what comes next because nothing else is allowed. This agreement is not conscious. It is structural. The universe does not decide to behave this way. It behaves this way because geometry leaves no alternative. The black hole interior thus represents the most disciplined environment nature permits. It is not governed by violence but by restriction. It is not defined by chaos but by certainty. As whatever final regime exists is approached, the universe does not slow or accelerate. It does not prepare. It simply continues. And when nothing remains that can differ, continuation itself becomes indistinguishable from conclusion. It has become complete in the only way that structure allows. Reality does not disappear, it does not collapse into nothing. It remains as the final expression of curvature, conservation, and constraint. And in that remaining, the black hole interior reveals something profound. Existence does not require freedom, meaning, or identity to persist. It requires only consistency. Inside a black hole, consistency is absolute, and absolute consistency leaves nothing left to ask for. At this depth, the interior of the black hole has reached a condition where even the idea of persistence begins to feel abstract. Because persistence normally implies the ability of something to remain recognizably itself across time, and inside a black hole, recognizability has already dissolved. What exists here does not endure as form or identity, it endures only as consistency with structure. Reality no longer preserves things, it preserves rules. The universe inside no longer behaves like a system unfolding through stages. Stages require contrast, and contrast requires difference that can survive long enough to be compared. Inside, difference is erased almost as soon as it arises. Each moment replaces the last completely, not violently, but thoroughly, leaving no remainder that could shape the next. This thorough replacement creates a condition where time exists without layering. Outside a black hole, time stacks moments, allowing patterns to form. Inside, time flattens moments into a single line with no thickness. There is sequence but no accumulation. The past does not inform the present. It is consumed by it. Because of this, the interior becomes a place where history cannot exist. History requires memory. Memory requires stability. Stability requires space to allow persistence. Inside a black hole, space does not allow persistence. It carries everything forward relentlessly, reshaping it as it goes. What exists here, then, is not matter enduring through time, but matter being continually redefined by curvature. Even the idea of matter becomes provisional. Matter is no longer something separate from space-time. It is an expression of space-time under extreme constraint. At this depth, it becomes clear that the black hole interior is not a place where reality breaks down, but a place where simplification becomes total. Everything that can be removed without violating conservation is removed. Everything that can be reduced without contradiction is reduced. What remains is the minimal expression of what the universe allows under those conditions. This minimal expression does not resemble emptiness, it resembles saturation. All allowable states have been explored, not sequentially, but structurally. There is nothing left to discover because discovery requires alternatives, and alternatives are gone. This does not mean that nothing happens. Processes still occur. Fields still fluctuate. Energy still evolves. But none of these processes introduce difference that can survive. They exist briefly and are absorbed into the same inward trajectory. This absorption gives the interior a strange stillness, not stillness as in lack of motion, but stillness as in lack of divergence. Everything moves, but everything moves together. There is no separation between motion and outcome. At this depth, the universe inside no longer distinguishes between essential and non-essential behavior. Everything that exists is essential because everything contributes to the same conclusion. Nothing is incidental, nothing is optional. This reveals a deeper truth about physical law. Laws are often thought of as constraints that guide systems while allowing creativity within them. Inside a black hole, laws become total. They do not guide, they determine. Determination here does not imply intention or purpose. It implies completeness. The universe has no reason to allow alternatives when geometry removes the possibility of alternatives existing. Because of this, the interior does not exhibit tension. Tension requires competing tendencies. Inside, there is no competition. Every tendency points in the same direction. This lack of competition does not make the interior peaceful in a human sense. Peace requires relief from struggle, and struggle requires agency. Inside a black hole, agency has no meaning. What exists simply unfolds according to structure. At this stage, even the notion of depth becomes symbolic. There is no deeper place that is qualitatively different from where one already is. The interior has become uniform in its inevitability. Everything that exists under the same rule set without exception. This uniformity suggests that whatever lies at the deepest level of a black hole is not separated by layers of mystery, but by a single continuous condition. The mystery does not deepen, it persists, and that persistence is not due to lack of understanding alone. It is due to the nature of the interior itself. The interior does not contain a secret that could be revealed if only we looked closely enough. It contains a regime where looking is no longer a meaningful act. Observation requires distinction. Measurement requires separation. Inside a black hole, separation collapses. Everything is part of the same inward progression. This makes the interior fundamentally different from any other unknown region of the universe. Other unknowns are unknown because we have not yet reached them. The interior is unknown because it is structurally unreachable. Yet, this unreachable region is not hypothetical. It exists as surely as anything else in the cosmos. It is created whenever a black hole forms. It persists as long as the black hole exists. Inside, reality does not ask to be known. It does not pause waiting for theory. It does not slow for comprehension. It continues according to the same principles that created it. As the final regime approaches, whatever that regime may be, the interior does not change character. It does not become more violent. It does not become more chaotic. It becomes more exact. Exactness here means that every remaining degree of freedom has been accounted for. Nothing is left undecided. Nothing remains that could introduce variation. This does not mean the universe has reached an endpoint in time. Time may continue beyond this regime in ways we cannot describe, but it does mean the universe has reached an endpoint in terms of differentiation. Nothing further can become distinct. At this depth, the idea of after loses meaning. After implies a difference from before. Inside a black hole, difference has been erased. The future is no longer a contrast with the present. It is the present continuing under the same condition. This is why the interior does not feel like an ending in the dramatic sense. There is no moment of closure, no final event, no resolution. Instead, there is sufficiency. The universe inside has everything it needs to be exactly what it is allowed to be. Nothing more, nothing less. This sufficiency does not imply perfection. It implies inevitability. The interior has fulfilled the logical consequences of its formation. It has carried structure to its limit. And when that limit is reached, whatever remains does not announce itself. It simply exists. Inside a black hole, what exists at this depth is not a mystery waiting for discovery. It is reality after discovery has become irrelevant. A condition where explanation ends not because reality disappears, but because reality no longer varies. And in that non-variation, the universe reveals the quiet extreme of existence itself. At this final depth, the interior of the black hole exists in a condition where even the idea of finality becomes unnecessary, because finality implies a contrast with continuation, and inside a black hole, contrast has already vanished. What exists here is not an end that follows a beginning, but a state where beginning and ending no longer serve as useful concepts. Reality has not stopped. It has simply exhausted every way it could meaningfully differ from itself. Inside, the universe no longer behaves like something moving toward a destination. Destinations require separation between where one is and where one will be. Here, separation has collapsed. The interior exists as a single uninterrupted condition where progression and arrival are indistinguishable. Time continues to order moments, but those moments no longer open into anything new. This does not mean that nothing occurs. Processes still unfold. Interactions still take place. Energy still exists and evolves. But none of these processes accumulate into outcomes that alter the overall condition. Each moment arises, completes its role, and dissolves into the same structure that produced it. The universe here does not conserve memory. Memory requires stability across time. Inside a black hole, stability has been stripped away completely. What exists now will not persist long enough to influence what comes next. The present continually replaces itself without leaving a trace. This replacement is not violent, it is thorough. The interior does not erase things through destruction, it erases them through irrelevance. Differences appear briefly and then vanish, not because they are forbidden, but because the structure does not allow them to matter. At this depth, the interior can no longer be described as a place containing objects, events, or even processes in the usual sense. What exists is closer to a rule being applied continuously without exception. Reality has become identical with its own constraints. Matter, energy, and space-time are no longer distinct categories. They are expressions of a single condition, unfolding according to conservation and curvature. The universe inside does not host things, it hosts inevitability. This inevitability does not feel rushed or forced, it feels complete. Decided, there is no tension between what is and what could be, because what could be has already been eliminated. The interior exists without expectation, without anticipation, without regret. Expectation requires uncertainty. Uncertainty requires alternatives. Inside a black hole, alternatives are gone. Because of this, the interior does not experience decay. Decay implies a transition from order to disorder. Inside, order has already become total. There is no room for disorder to emerge. There is only the steady expression of structure until nothing remains that can vary. At this stage, even the concept of existence becomes minimal. Existence no longer means persistence of identity, it means compliance with structure. To exist inside a black hole is simply to unfold according to geometry until unfolding itself no longer produces distinction. This is why the interior cannot be meaningfully observed or described beyond a certain point. Observation requires separation, description requires distinction. Inside, separation and distinction have been removed by the same conditions that allow the black hole to exist. The universe does not hide something at this depth. There is no secret waiting to be uncovered. What exists is fully expressed, but it is expressed in a way that does not support interpretation. This challenges a deep assumption. We often assume that reality must be intelligible to exist. The interior of a black hole shows that intelligibility is optional. Reality can persist in forms that do not allow understanding, not because they are illogical, but because they are too consistent. Consistency at this depth has become absolute. There are no exceptions, no deviations, no fluctuations that can grow into something else. Everything that exists in agreement with everything else. This agreement is not harmony in a poetic sense, it is alignment without alternative. The universe inside has become a single statement repeated continuously without variation. At this point, asking what exists inside a black hole becomes less a question about content and more a question about condition. What exists is not a collection of things. It is a way of being that leaves no room for difference. This way of being does not end. It does not transition into something else. It remains as long as the black hole remains. And even when the black hole itself eventually fades from the outside through slow processes we understand, the interior, whatever form it takes, is not undone by that fading in any simple sense. The interior was never defined by the horizon as a surface, it was defined by structure, and structure does not vanish simply because its external boundary changes. This suggests that what exists inside a black hole is not something that can be erased or reversed. It is not a temporary anomaly, it is a legitimate mode of existence permitted by the laws of the universe, a mode where freedom collapses, a mode where meaning dissolves, a mode where reality persists without requiring interpretation. Inside a black hole, existence does not need to be experienced to be real. It does not need to be understood to continue, it does not need to lead anywhere to be complete. It simply unfolds until unfolding itself no longer produces difference, and when that happens there is no moment that can be pointed to as an ending. There is no final event, there is only sufficiency. The universe inside has expressed everything it can express under those conditions. Nothing remains that could alter the out. Nothing remains that could ask for more. This is not annihilation. It is not emptiness. It is not silence. It is existence without variation, a reality so constrained that it no longer changes in any meaningful way, yet continues because nothing prevents it from continuing. Inside a black hole, what exists at the deepest level is not a mystery waiting for discovery. It is the quiet consequence of consistency carried to its absolute limit. And beyond that limit, whatever remains does not announce itself. It simply is. That is what exists inside a black hole when all questions have lost their context. Not an answer, but a condition where answers are no longer required. At this depth, the interior of the black hole no longer feels like a phenomenon unfolding within the universe, but like a condition that the universe itself has entered. What exists here is not something contained by spacetime, but spacetime expressing itself without remainder. The distinction between environment and event has dissolved. Reality is no longer something that happens somewhere. It is something that happens as structure. Inside, the universe no longer carries the tension between what is and what might be. That tension, which drives nearly all complexity outside a black hole, has been resolved completely. Possibility has not been forbidden, it has been rendered unnecessary. Every allowable outcome has already been absorbed into the same narrow progression, leaving no room for divergence. This does not produce emptiness. It produces saturation. The interior is not lacking content. It is filled with content so completely aligned with structure that nothing stands apart long enough to be identified as separate. Difference has not been destroyed. It has been equalized. Time here becomes almost transparent. It still orders events, but it no longer creates distance between them in any meaningful sense. Moments occur, but they do not accumulate. They do not build. They do not lead toward novelty. Each moment replaces the previous one so fully that nothing remains to compare. This replacement is not violent. It is gentle in its inevitability. The interior does not rush toward a conclusion. It does not hesitate either. It proceeds because nothing interrupts proceeding. The universe here has no need for urgency, because urgency requires alternatives. At this stage, the interior can no longer be described in terms of motion through space. Space has lost its role as a stage. It is no longer something that contains events. It is something that defines them completely. Everything that exists is already embedded in the same inward structure. Because of this, the idea of direction becomes symbolic. There is no left or right, no above or below. There is only alignment with the structure that defines the interior. Movement exists, but it exists as compliance, not exploration. This compliance is total. There are no exceptions. No particles behave differently. No fields escape alignment. No interactions introduce deviation. The universe inside a black hole has become exact in a way that leaves no room for surprise. Exactness here does not mean simplicity. Conditions may still be extreme. Curvature may still be immense. Energy densities may still vary. But these variations do not matter in the way they matter outside. They cannot change the global condition. They cannot open new futures. This reveals a truth that is easy to miss. The universe is not obligated to remain interesting. It is not obligated to sustain complexity. Complexity arises when geometry allows it. When geometry removes that allowance, complexity fades without resistance. Inside a black hole, complexity is not attacked. It is unsupported. As complexity fades, what remains is not nothingness, but the most stripped-down expression of physical law. Conservation still applies, consistency still applies. But creativity, in the sense of producing new arrangements, does not. This is why the interior feels final without being terminal. It is final in terms of variation, not in terms of existence. Existence continues, but it no longer produces difference. At this depth, even the idea of after loses relevance. After implies that something new could follow. Inside, nothing new can follow, because nothing remains that could change the condition. The present does not lead into a different future, it continues as itself. This continuation is not boredom or stagnation, those are experiential concepts. Inside a black hole, experience itself has no foothold. Experience requires memory, contrast, and persistence. None of these survive here. What exists instead is process without awareness, sequence without story, persistence without identity. This kind of existence is deeply alien to us because we evolved in a universe where openness was abundant. Our intuition assumes that reality must always allow alternatives. The black hole interior shows that this assumption is conditional, not fundamental. There are regimes where the universe closes itself completely, not out of necessity or intention, but as a consequence of its own structure. Inside a black hole, structure has become destiny. This destiny does not need to be fulfilled dramatically. It does not arrive in a final event. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes unavoidable long before it is reached. By the time this depth is reached, everything that exists is already part of the same outcome. Nothing remains undecided. Nothing remains contingent. The universe inside has already done all the deciding it will ever do. This does not mean that reality has failed or collapsed. It means that reality has followed its own rules to a place where those rules leave no room for interpretation. At this stage, the interior is no longer a question waiting for an answer. It is an answer that does not take the form of explanation. It is a demonstration that the universe can sustain existence even when meaning, identity, and variation have been removed. This challenge is one of the deepest assumptions we carry. We often believe that meaning is tied to existence, that something must matter in order to be real. Inside a black hole, mattering disappears, but reality remains. The universe does not care whether something matters, it cares only whether something is consistent. Inside a black hole, consistency has become absolute. There is no conflict between laws, no tension between forces, no competition between outcomes. Everything that exists in agreement with the same inward structure. This agreement is not harmony. Harmony implies balance between different elements. Inside, difference itself has been erased. What remains is alignment without contrast. At this depth, the interior becomes almost silent conceptually. Not silent in the sense of lacking activity, but silent in the sense of lacking distinction. There is nothing left to point to as separate from the whole. This silence does not imply peace or rest. Those ideas belong to conscious systems. It implies sufficiency. The universe inside has no further work to do. It has expressed everything that can be expressed under those conditions. This sufficiency does not require an endpoint. It does not require closure. It simply persists because nothing interrupts it. And even if, from the outside, the black hole itself eventually fades through slow processes that unfold over unimaginable spans of time, the interior condition is not undone in any simple sense. The interior was never defined by the horizon as a surface. It was defined by structure, and structure does not vanish simply because an external boundary changes. What exists inside a black hole at this depth is therefore not something that can be erased or reversed. It is not a temporary state. It is a legitimate mode of existence permitted by the universe, a mode where possibility has been evenly distributed until it no longer acts, a mode where time orders events without creating stories, a mode where existence persists without identity. Inside a black hole, reality reaches a form so complete that nothing further can be added or removed without contradiction. And when reality reaches that form, it does not stop. It remains, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, not as a secret hidden behind a veil, but as a condition where questions themselves have lost the structure they need to exist. That is what exists at this depth. Not an object, not an answer, but existence continuing when variation has finally been exhausted.